In 2013, when I was a medical student, I wrote an essay entitled #No More Textbooks. And this was for the Canadian Undergraduate Surgical Education Committee essay competition, which I actually won. In the essay, I wrote, "Tomorrow I start my vascular surgery rotation. Before bed tonight, I will watch a YouTube video of a femoral-popliteal bypass surgery, review the surgical anatomy from Zollinger's Atlas of Surgical Operations on my iPad while waiting for my car tires to be changed, listen to a podcast on peripheral vascular disease while riding my exercise bike, and perhaps tweet about my new rotation." At the time when I was a medical student, I really felt strongly that the future of surgical education and surgical textbooks in particular would be virtual. To explore that possible future, I spoke on this episode with Tanner Schrank, the head of impact for the Journal of Medical Insight, which we call JOMI throughout the episode. JOMI is a website that showcases a wide range of operations across multiple disciplines. What I really like about JOMI is the in-depth interviews that are done with surgeons before the operation, where the surgeon will describe their thought process and indications for the operation. The videos are also extraordinarily well done and well filmed, often from multiple camera angles and with really fantastic detail. And if anyone who's listening has ever tried to film their own videos, you'll know that it is incredibly difficult to get good, high quality video, particularly of open operations. So JOMI clearly offers a fantastic resource for residents and attendings to learn new surgical techniques. Tanner and I also discussed some of the perhaps unintended implications for a transition to a virtual textbook that is more reliant on video than an actual written textbook. It's an interesting thing to think about, especially in the light of this idea and the pretty good evidence at this point that reading something and actively trying to absorb that information is more effective than passively viewing it. In other words, I'm in two minds, and this is especially funny as someone who's producing a podcast. To be, I'm in a bit of two minds about whether video and podcasts really can replace formal surgical textbooks and written uh, media, whether that's on your iPad or on a textbook is a separate issue. But I really am in two minds about whether video can replace that. I always remember what Anders Ericsson said, the famous psychologist who popularized this idea of 10,000 hours. It's this idea of deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is required to gain mastery, not just practice. And I'm not sure that watching video gives you that same experience. I do think, however, that video needs to augment the learning that we do as surgeons. And at Queen's, we use video review on a weekly basis to give trainees feedback and even for ourselves to get better at operations and improve our own technique. This was a great conversation with Tanner from JOMI about what JOMI has to offer. And I encourage all our listeners to check out JOMI. And we'll put a link to the website in the show notes. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Do you think videos are the way of the future for surgical textbooks? Shoot us an email at podcast.cjs@gmail.com.
Welcome to the Cold Steel Surgical Podcast with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball.
So maybe we could just start by asking you to tell me a little bit about where you grew up and where you did your training.
Sure. So I'm originally from Wisconsin in the US. I'm Dr. Tanner Schrank. I went to medical school in Poland and attended the Jagiellonian University Medical College in English. A lot of people think that if you go to school in Poland, you go to school in Polish, but no, it was in English. And after graduating in 2019, I began working in medical education with Amboss first.
So what was the impetus to go to Poland?
It's a great question. So I had my first degree in linguistics, and my wife and I wanted to travel abroad and use our degrees. She has a teaching English degree, so we moved to Korea and taught English there for 2 years, and we loved it. But my MCAT scores were running out of time, and so I had to either choose to go to medical school or let them expire and then wind up taking the MCAT all over again. So I decided, well, I'm going to go to med school. And we wanted to continue traveling. We wanted to go to some place outside the US. We wanted to go somewhere where she could teach English. I wanted to go to a program in 4 years, not 6 years, like the standard in Europe. And so it kind of narrowed down all of my options. And we had never been to Poland. We'd never been to Europe. And so it sounded really good to us. And so I applied and got into Krakow, and we absolutely loved it. After 4 years of med school, even graduating, we stayed for 5 more years. So we really, really loved it there.
What's the medical school system like in Poland? Is it how many years is it?
So the normal system is 6 years straight out of high school. That's how Poles go to med school there. But if you have a degree from university and you're not Polish, right, then you can go to the English program. And when I was going, they had 2 English programs, one for 6 years for people like Norwegians, right? People in Europe with a university degree who want to go to school in English. I was in the 4-year MD program. So this is mostly for Americans and Canadians. And it's because we already have a 4-year MD or a 4-year university degree. So
Wow, that must have been quite an experience. Where in Poland were you living or doing your studies?
in Krakow.
And did you have to learn Polish?
Yeah. We had to take a medical Polish class. We had to learn how to interview patients in Polish. We got training on how to, go around our daily life, order food, and go to the grocery store and things like that. And we were always paired with like a bilingual classmate of ours. So about, I think, between a half and a third of the class was Polish speaking natively. And so they would be with us in the clinic and they would help translate with the actual patients.
So are you still in Poland now?
Currently, I'm in Portugal, but in 2023, my wife and I decided to pack our bags and hit the road, and we've been traveling full time ever since. So we don't have an apartment or a home base or anything.
That is so cool. You're living like the true dream that I think many people have of like really like living and seeing the world, and that's so cool.
Right.
So, I mean, now I'm totally on a different tangent here.
Exactly.
But
Yep.
what is that like? What is life like as like obviously you're a professional. You have a I'm sure you have you're doing all this stuff now for JOMI, and previous to that with Amboss. Like, how do you
Mhm.
manage
Mhm.
the traveling plus having a job and
Mhm.
and all those things?
It's a lot to balance. It's exactly what we wanted, though. So you have to figure out your own process. And what I found is that I can sort of hunker down in one place and get my work done and still balance that with getting out and seeing the sights and enjoying where I am. And we've gone through a lot of different versions of this, right? We've done the one night here, take a bus to the next city, and then spend 2 nights there, that sort of travel. We've done trying to work while on a trip, like actively moving, like trying to send emails on the bus. And we've also done it like how we're doing now, where we're actually dog sitting in Portugal in the countryside for a week. And so I, get to do my work online. And I was just at a surgical conference before this. So I balanced, showing up in person with the remote work. And that's exactly how I did it at Amboss as well. You do road shows where you visit medical students in medical schools, or you go to conferences, and then you're taking care of all the other administrative work offline or remotely online.
So, you didn't end up practicing clinically, and was that always a plan for you as well, or is that something you flirted with and decided against because of the love for travel?
Yeah, I kind of went back and forth. So when I started med school, I kind of thought that I would do residency, And then the more we were traveling, we were living in Europe. We wound up going to every country in Europe in those 4 years. And so we were constantly traveling. And the less I was feeling like I wanted to be stuck in one place for a residency program, I looked at going to the UK for the foundation program. I looked at Ireland, Malta, all kinds of different places. And I settled on basically getting into medical education and explored that. And I've loved it ever since.
That's so cool. That's so neat. So, tell us a little bit about Amboss. What was Amboss? How did you get involved in that? And what was that experience like?
Yeah. So I used Amboss as a medical student, and it's a digital medical education platform designed to help students and physicians be better prepared for the clinic and for their exams. And so I used it because they have a medical library where you can look up any condition, any disease, and now any drug. They have a drug database attached to it too. And then most medical students are aware of it because they have a question bank where they have all these multiple choice questions that are designed for, the USMLE or the UKMLA or the MCCQE in Canada, all these standardized exams. And there's a team of medical editors who sits down and writes all of these. And so they're very, high quality. And they have two different apps. And so I would use these while traveling or commuting or waiting for a lecture to start. And I would just study this way. And then when I graduated in 2019, there was an opening for a partnerships manager. And so this was basically going around and telling students and physicians and schools what Amboss was and how you can use it to improve your medical education. And eventually I became a senior partnerships manager. I started the Amboss podcast, Beyond the Textbook. We had a couple seasons of that. We did all these interviews. And I covered the English speaking parts of Europe, as well as Poland and surrounding countries and Canada. And so I was very involved in this. And then I decided to branch out and move away from that. And I saw that JOMI, the Surgical Video Journal, was hiring. And so I had heard about this years before, but they weren't in a position to hire me. I wasn't in a position to work for them. And then the stars aligned and they hired me. That was last year.
Yeah. So just for context for our listeners and our audience, we actually met at the SAGES conference, right? It was at the SAGES conference, which is the Society of American Gastrointestinal and Endoscopic Surgeons. One of my favorite conferences. I have no allegiance, I'm not paid by SAGES or anything like that, but I just love SAGES. The conference is great because I get to meet people like Tanner and other cool people who attend the conference. But I actually had heard of JOMI and seen JOMI before I ran into you at SAGES. But maybe for the folks who haven't seen JOMI or heard of JOMI before, can you talk a little bit like what does JOMI stand for? What is JOMI?
Sure. So it's JOMI, JOMI. That's Journal of Medical Insight. And I like to say it's a surgical video journal. So at the most basic level, we film, edit, and publish masterclass surgical videos to make students and young surgical trainees better prepared for the OR. And this is in the form of long form surgical videos that are filmed from incision to closure, and even with pre-op and post-op interviews where the operating surgeon narrates the entire case throughout. And then we add, special animations and medical anatomical landmarks, things like that to improve the case. And then it's peer reviewed. So every one of our cases is peer reviewed before it's published. And then they're published as soon as they're ready. And this is how it's a journal, but I see it also as like a video database. So students can go in there and look for, cholecystectomy, and 10 different videos come up because we have 10 different cases that were cholecystectomies, whether they were open, laparoscopic, robotic, all kinds. And then we also have like prep videos for surgical technologists or for nurses. We have basics and fundamentals. We cover everything. And we're constantly filming more cases and publishing more cases.
It's kind of a novel concept for a medical journal in a way. Novel in, in the sense that like it really has it, in my opinion, it sort of reimagined what a medical textbook or a surgical textbook would look like. In many ways, I think this is following the trend of a lot of other surgical journals, in that a lot of surgical journals now have really leaned heavily into video. The late Neil Smart, who is the editor-in-chief of colorectal disease, made a huge push to put that journal onto YouTube. I think they had some ridiculous number of videos that went up while he was the editor-in-chief. And all the major journals, ASCRS, New England Journal of Medicine, every journal is really trying to push into that space. I do want to ask a few specific questions about JOMI, because I think JOMI has really made that, I think, taken the next step, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that it's really taken the next step to try to imagine what a textbook of the future would look like. So how do you actually pick which operations and which surgeons to actually go and record with?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get that every time we go to a conference, every time we talk with an interested surgeon. So I'm the head of impact, and that means that I take care of sales and marketing. And then we also have another department that's editorial, and that's led by our managing editor, Chris Boisvert. And he, along with our editorial board and our content acquisitions editors, they make a list of priority cases based on whether we need another case to fulfill, the SCORE curriculum for general surgery, or whether this is a very often requested case. Then we'll prioritize that. And what we're basically doing is trying to build out the most fundamental cases and the most life-saving cases. So instead of like having every single aesthetics and plastic surgery case, we try to have, 10 different cholecystectomies, or we have the bread and butter cases. These are the ones, that every surgeon needs to see, and in different ways. The surgeon from Stanford does it differently from Mass General in Boston. And what we like to do is really flesh out the most needed cases, the need to have, and then we'll get to the nice to have. And so currently we're focused on general surgery. We have, I think, 140 of those, something like that. And then we have lots of orthopedics, ENT. We have some basics and fundamentals, like I mentioned, and then a smattering of others, from vascular to urology, everything in between. And so our team, we prioritize everything, and then we also are open to submissions. So we've had surgeons in Tokyo send us videos of surgeries they've done, and some of them get published if they're good enough, and some of them go back to be re-recorded or be resubmitted.
So how and why did JOMI get created? In a way, this has sort of been taken, like I alluded to, it's sort of been taken up by subspecialty journals. The Journal of Neurosurgery publishes video submissions, colorectal disease. The American Society of Colorectal Surgery Journal, DCR, will publish journals. Obviously, the orthopedic journals will publish videos. Why did JOMI get created, and what was the impetus to have a journal that really is sort of its own thing and trying to incorporate all these different other specialties into it?
Yeah, so our founder, Nikita Bernstein, basically saw a gap in surgical education. And so his goal is to improve patient outcomes. And one way to do that is to make better prepared surgical trainees and medical students and new surgeons. And to do that, you can film these very high quality videos with the best surgeons around the country and make it available for anyone who can get a subscription, basically, right? And that was the general idea. And this was back in 2013-ish. And so since it started around Boston, he reached out to Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. And in exchange for, letting us film their cases, they also received these resources for their trainees. And our oldest videos are from 2014, and we're all the way up to, I think, 351. We just had 9 videos released in April. And so from that beginning of trying to, improve patient outcomes by approaching the closest, best hospital, now we're reaching across the country, across the globe, with users all over the place and cases coming in from all over the place. And the idea is still the same. We want to improve patient outcomes. We want to prepare better students, better surgeons. And the way we see that is having our crew of videographers come and film these long cases. Usually, they can be 2-3 hours or much, much longer. And we have multiple camera angles. We have a GoPro on the surgeon's head. We have someone standing with, a boom mic with a tripod camera, all kinds of different things. And this is to ensure that we have this high quality footage that our editorial team can then cut down into one comprehensive and understandable video with the narration throughout. And then we add these animations, these anatomical landmarks. And that really, we have found, is what residents have been missing. It's this resource that you can pause, you can rewind, you can just listen to the whole thing, and you don't have to feel bad for asking any stupid questions because the surgeon is telling you, oh, this is, not an artery, this is actually a vein. Okay, you can watch the whole case and find that out. And so basically there was a need and we thought we could fill that. And we've gotten great feedback from our institutions who love our cases. They always come up and meet us at conferences like where we met you. And we've tried to expand as much as we can, like we said, with all these different specialties. And there's a lot of room to grow still.
I'm biased in that I think there definitely are still gaps in the way that we're trained. And I particularly think surgery is such a visual field. For better or worse, it was reliant on recognizing normal, abnormal anatomy, recognizing pathology from not pathology. And certainly surgical drawings and textbooks are great, but it's not quite like seeing the actual operation itself. And we might come back to that because I do have some perhaps reservations about the direction that we've been moving to in terms of education in general. But I'm curious about a bit about the success so far of JOMI. You said you've had great reviews and you've had residents, I think, that really have enjoyed using JOMI. Tell us a little bit about how the business model works and how many subscribers do you have, and how do you make a journal like this work? Because as I think many of our listeners will know, it's difficult to actually keep a journal of any kind afloat in today's very competitive publishing landscape.
Yeah, that's very true. We hear from librarians all the time that they're constantly looking at journals and their budgets are always being cut. And so they have to choose which ones to continue to subscribe to. And on the other side, journals don't have infinite budgets. So we've run very lean so far, and it's still very much like startup size. And from the way that we began, we're still basically running the same business model. So we reach out to institutions And we can provide this resource to all of their residents, all of their students, all of their attendings, PAs, nurses, whoever you have in the OR. We can provide that with an institutional subscription, or they can subscribe individually. Just like every other journal out there, you can subscribe monthly or yearly. Sometimes we have discounts. We can provide trials. If you come up to our booth at a conference, you can definitely get a longer free trial, things like that. But then we also are exploring new avenues. So recently we've gone into looking at industry partnerships. So this is quite an interesting way to go. We want to keep our academic integrity, of course, but we're open to working with, things like open evidence, or if there's a surgical instrument out there that the surgeon happens to be using, we have no problem, having them sponsor the video. It doesn't change the patient outcome. And so we're happy to provide that resource. And we also have a very flexible model because we are such a small company. So we'll um, we'll provide different pricing based on the purchasing power of the user. So if they're in a country with not as much money, then they get a lower subscription rate. And some places we give it for free. So we work with the Research for Life program. And so countries in the Hinari Group A, they get free access to us. Group B, they get reduced access. And so this is kind of our way to make sure that there's equity among learners. And so it's subscription based. It's institutional subscription is a huge aspect of it. And we're exploring industry partnerships. Yeah, I think that's in a nutshell.
How do you actually, you mentioned you have a full team of videographers. Is that the same for whether it's minimally invasive case like a laparoscopic or robotic case versus an open case? Because certainly there's less, it's less difficult obviously to film a minimally invasive case where you can just pull the feed right off the tower. So, and I'm curious, like, what does that team look like? How do you actually go about recording? Like, is it just you have cameras everywhere? You have camera in the light, or you just have someone set up a camera? Because it's actually quite difficult once you start trying to do this, and I have. It's very difficult to actually record cases. For my fellowship, I actually tried to record every case. So I actually bought a head-mounted camera, and it's not easy. Like it turns out like your eyes are not exactly looking where your head is. Like if you're dissecting deep in the pelvis, there's lots of battery and data and recording issues. I think I ended up only recording like 20% of the cases that I actually did, and not because I didn't try, but just I lost a lot of these videos, or they weren't good enough to actually learn anything from.
You talk to any surgeon who's tried to film any cases, and they say the exact same thing. They say, how do you ensure the high quality? How do you get these angles? Yeah, we've run into the exact same thing. And so, like you said, minimally invasive ones are much easier because you already have one camera there. The one inside the patient is already being recorded, and you can add that right in. But what we like to do is at least have 3 or 4 camera angles on our best videos. And this is going to be one camera mounted on a tripod for a panorama of the entire scene. We have usually one GoPro on the surgeon's head, and on the outside of their mask, then we also clip a mic. We found that prevents scratching if it was on their gown, and it's easiest to catch their speech instead of trying to get a boom in there between them and the patient. And then usually there's also a videographer floating with another camera on a tripod. And this, you can try to get in to see incisions. You can try to see exactly another angle of the instrumentation from the surgeon or from another surgeon. And so that's 3 angles. And then if it's laparoscopic, the 4th is inside. And those are definitely easier. I think that like the robotic ones and the laparoscopic ones are definitely not as interesting to watch as a viewer. because you're just watching someone's hands, manipulating the robot controls. But of course, they're better for the patient and a lot easier to film. So yeah, our videography crew is made up of the head of video, and then we have a supporting videographer, and oftentimes they'll go and visit the hospital after we secure, the patient confidentiality and the rights to film there. They'll go and they'll film with the surgeon. They'll interview them ahead of time, and sometimes they train the surgeons and leave some of the filming equipment if we think that they are, equipped to film their own case, and we have other cases to go and film. Then we'll leave some stuff there. But often we're going to like Pennsylvania or California and filming this entire case. And sometimes we'll have like an entire week of filming lined up at the same hospital, a case on Monday, Tuesday. Or in some cases, when we try to get trauma content, we don't know what's going to come up, right? So we'll just go to the hospital and wait with the surgeon, and whatever comes up, we hope that it's a good case. And we got some really interesting content. There's gunshot wounds. There's very interesting cases in there from trauma. And, we also go on shooting trips. So our CEO went on a medical mission to the Philippines. He just went to Malawi recently and did a whole filming there. And so when you get in these different areas with different resources, usually lower income countries, middle income countries, you get to see a lot of different approaches, different ways to do the same procedure, different ways to use limited resources. And so those are some of my favorite cases, is where we go and film those in other countries.
Yeah, and it's a good point you make about the emergency cases. You basically have to be set up and ready to record virtually every case if you want to capture those cases. And those are often, some of the toughest cases that we as surgeons deal with are the emergency cases, right? I'm curious where you've obviously been in this space for a while with Amboss and now with JOMI. I'm curious where you think the future of surgical and maybe even just medical education is going. And I'll tell you my bias. So I've been in this space as well for a while. Even as a medical student, I loved listening to podcasts and helped make some episodes for the Surgery 101 podcast. And my thinking on this has evolved over the years. So I was very kind of gung-ho about this idea of learning from videos, learning from podcasts. And I'm an auditory learner. So for me, it totally makes sense to learn from videos. I homeschooled as well. So for me, I had to have resources that I turned to in lieu of having a teacher. So to me, it made total sense that we should have all kinds of interactive, engaging resources that aren't just textbooks. But I guess my thinking has somewhat changed in that I think there is something that you get out of reading a book and engaging with the text and having that forceful, effortful kind of learning or studying that makes you retain information in a different way than in some ways passively receiving that information. And I also, on the flip side of that, am also very concerned about our increasingly addicted brains and the way that we're wired and hooked on social media, and we can't disengage from that constant dopamine hit of online stuff. And I worry a little bit about the edutainment kind of aspect. And I'm guilty of this too, as part of our Cold Steel podcast. So I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about where you think the future of surgical and medical education is going.
That's a really interesting question. And I've tried to dig into this. I've asked this question on my podcast too. And I think I can see 5 different ways to answer this question. I feel very similar to you. I would say one of the most important priorities for me is accessibility and usability. And having a fair and equitable access to resources, especially among education, is super important. And so I think that video resources, podcasts, anything recorded that you can share with a classmate, or that you can pause, rewind, watch at 2 times speed, or even download and take with you and listen at your leisure or watch at your leisure. I think that that is paramount. I think that everyone should have access to that. Those are my most used resources in medical school, and I still think that is super, super handy. And it really comes in really it comes in handy when a surgeon is about to walk into a surgery and they need to just brush up on one little thing. Well, you can watch that on your phone. And so that's one side. And then another side is like what we saw when the pandemic rolled around, which was, yeah, in-person education is really important. Textbooks are really important. Some of this can be supplemented and to some degree replaced with videos and podcasts, but you can't replace all of education with videos, right? You see people who had their only form of education during that time being video, they get lower scores. And how do you do manual skill learning? How do you learn how to suture if you're not standing shoulder to shoulder with your advisor or your tutor? And so I think a lot of surgical education has to be hands-on. You can watch all the videos you want about suturing and knot tying, and we have a lot of those videos, so I encourage you to watch those. But at the end of the day, you have to tie it yourself. You have to do it yourself. Even if you go and buy, like in Poland, we would buy a chicken thigh or a pork leg and just sew it on there. That works. So you have to have some form of physical, dexterity learning. And so that's two different things. A third one is, like you said, there's something to be said about learning from a textbook, learning from a master, in a master and apprentice sort of dynamic. You can ask a question in person, especially in the OR, that you just can't watching a video. And we try to cover that with all of our videos, that's why the narration is there. But eventually you're going to be in the OR, and you might have to ask one of these questions, and that's a great way to learn as well. And then sort of the last way that you're talking about is, what if we lean too heavily on being on our phones all the time, or videoing everything, or even gamifying too much? Like I have a degree in linguistics, and so I feel very strongly about learning languages, and I purposely changed how I learn languages. I don't use apps on my phone anymore to learn it. I just go and talk to people to learn it. And of course, that's not for everyone, but I think that's very similar with education, where there is a real risk that you can convince yourself that you're really good at something because you did it all in an app or on your phone or online. But until you prove it, it could be a quiz, it could be continuing medical education, CME credits, it could be testing yourself with a mock exam, or asking someone to coach you on what would you do if this artery was cut, some curveball is thrown to you. Until you investigate that in yourself and really evaluate how prepared you are for things you weren't studying, you don't really know if you learned that information. And so that's, kind of how I transitioned away from like apps like Duolingo. And now I just go and talk to someone, because sure, I can learn how to say like the penguin has nightmares or something, but I want to go and say, how much is the apple, So I think that's very similar to medical education. Is you have to test yourself.
Yeah, I think there's obviously many components to this, right? I think that's the part where it gets tricky, right? I think there's probably different resources for different elements of medical and surgical education, right? So, maybe you need to pick up the textbook to really understand the pathophysiology of something, or like really get a good understanding of, the anatomy or preoperative, whatever. But the steps to an operation, yeah, for sure. I think video potentially could be very helpful for that. And I really liked the last thing you just said about there has to be some level of engagement, which is really what testing is, right? In a way, testing is requiring you to pay attention because you're going to be tested on it. It's not so much the test, but what goes into preparing for the test, I think, in many ways, is what really kind of keeps you motivated and keeps you listening and engaged in a different way. I'm curious if JOMI is looking to get into that space. Is there some way of using those videos? I'm curious if there's some evaluation component or some testing component that is going to be part of JOMI in the future.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would segue into is we have added a quizzing feature. So after you watch the video, you can test yourself on how well you understood the procedure and did you learn all the important things. And instructors can make these quizzes and give them to all their students. Students can pass them around to other students. And eventually we hope to get to a place where this can qualify for CME credit. So continuing medical education credits. So residents and even attendings can come in and see, oh, there's a new robotic case on a cholecystectomy. Oh, wow. Did I learn something? And now I get a credit for it or half a credit or whatever it is.
It's been really, really great to talk to you. And it's really, I've learned a lot and enjoyed hearing you talk about JOMI and some of your thoughts about surgical education. I'm curious where JOMI is moving forward in the future and what's next and where's next for Tanner Schrank.
Yeah, JOMI, the sky's the limit, really. We are very close to signing some big deals with some big institutions and some big industry partners. So we hope to have some big announcements about those. We're constantly going to more conferences, so we'll probably run into each other again. I personally am trying to get as many medical students and residents to at least watch JOMI videos, whether they subscribe or not. As soon as they find out about JOMI, they're like, where has this been my whole life, So that's where I want to go. I want to get it in everyone's eyes. And yeah, personally, I've already been to all 7 continents. I think I'm slowing down a little bit, going back to revisit some places. I have to go back to Krakow every year in the spring. June is a perfect time to go back, so I'll be there then. Just trying to visit friends all around the world and make new connections as well.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you have comments or questions, please email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.